Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Explore Everything. Today we're stepping into the dark heart of 1960s London, a time when glamour met violence and two twin brothers ruled the East End with fear and fame. Ronnie and Reggie Kray, identical twins, nightclub owners, gang leaders, and the faces of organized crime. Behind their polished suits and celebrity friends, they controlled London's underworld with an iron grip. Their rise was as fast as their downfall was brutal. This is the story of the Kray twins, the feared kings of London's East End. And Reggie Kray were born on October 24, 1933, in Hoxton, East London, into a tough working-class family. Their father, Charles Kray, was a casual clothing dealer, often away at sea to avoid conscription, while their mother, Violet, was a strong, protective figure who adored her sons. The East End they grew up in was not the glamorous London of postcards. It was a world shaped by bombings of World War II, poverty, and survival instincts. Streets were filled with black market dealers, returning soldiers, and people struggling to rebuild their lives after the devastation of the Blitz. And Reggie Kray were born on October 24, 1933, in Hoxton, East London, into a tough working-class family. Their father, Charles Kray, was a casual clothing dealer, often away at sea to avoid conscription, while their mother, Violet, was a strong, protective figure who adored her sons. The East End they grew up in was not the glamorous London of postcards. It was a world shaped by bombings of World War II, poverty, and survival instincts. Streets were filled with black market dealers, returning soldiers, and people struggling to rebuild their lives after the devastation of the Blitz. From a very early age, the twins displayed a wild temper and fierce loyalty to each other. They were inseparable. If you fought one, you fought both. School reports described them as disruptive, aggressive, and fearless, and they quickly became notorious among their peers for their willingness to throw punches over the slightest provocation. They trained in boxing, which was one of the few respectable escapes for working-class boys at the time. In fact, both brothers showed real talent in the ring. Reggie in particular was known for his precision and agility, while Ronnie relied on raw power and intensity. Their early boxing careers gave them discipline, physical dominance, and local fame. But the same aggression that made them dangerous fighters also made them troublemakers. They were repeatedly involved in street brawls, fights with rival groups, and small-time crimes. Their neighborhood was dominated by tough gangs, and the twins quickly realized that in post-war East London, strength and fear commanded respect more than law. As teenagers, they began forming their own crew, gathering local boys who admired their courage and ability to stand up to anyone. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore, they were laying the foundations of power. During this period, London was undergoing massive change. The old criminal empires were weakened, leaving room for new, younger, and more ruthless figures to step in. The Krays exploited this power vacuum. They used their reputation as unbeatable street fighters to take control of their neighborhood, moving from petty brawls to organized protection rackets. Shopkeepers, bar owners, and locals began paying them for security, not because they trusted them but because they feared the consequences of saying no. Their tough East End upbringing shaped everything about their criminal identity. They understood the psychology of fear, the importance of loyalty, and the value of appearing untouchable. By their late teens, Ronnie and Reggie weren't just neighborhood troublemakers anymore. They were rising figures in the London underworld, feared by enemies and admired by those who saw them as local legends who stood their ground in a harsh world. By the early 1950s, Ronnie and Reggie Kray had already earned a fearsome reputation on the streets of East London. But unlike many local gang leaders who remained small-time, the twins had bigger ambitions. They understood that to truly dominate they needed more than fists. They needed organization, strategy, and image. And that's how their criminal network, famously known as the Firm, began to take shape. The idea of the Firm was simple but powerful. Build a loyal inner circle, control specific territories, and run all illegal activity through a structured system. Instead of chaotic brawls and random crime, the Krays brought a level of discipline and planning that made them stand out. They began recruiting trusted men from their neighborhood, people they grew up with, men who were bound by loyalty, fear, and the promise of shared wealth. This inner circle formed the backbone of their operations. Their early ventures focused heavily on protection rackets. They approached local businesses, pubs, clubs, and shops, offering protection for a weekly fee. If owners refused, they faced smashed windows, violent intimidation, or worse. But if they accepted, the Krays ensured that no rival gangs touched their business. This carrot and stick approach allowed them to gradually take over large portions of East End commerce without open warfare. What truly set them apart, however, was their dual nature. On the surface, they presented themselves as respectable businessmen. They wore immaculate suits, carried themselves with confidence, and spoke with authority. Behind closed doors, they were ruthless enforcers who tolerated no betrayal. Ronnie, with his unpredictable and volatile nature, instilled terror in anyone who crossed them, while Reggie handled the business side, calculated, smooth, and persuasive. A crucial move in building the firm was their decision to expand beyond the East End. They set their sights on London's West End, the glamorous heart of the city. There, money flowed through nightclubs, casinos, and entertainment venues. The twins started buying and taking control of nightclubs, turning them into hubs for their operations. These clubs weren't just moneymakers. They were strategic meeting points, where criminal deals were struck in back rooms while celebrities and socialites danced in the front. Their influence spread rapidly. Soon, their organization controlled illegal gambling dens, black market dealings, armed robberies, and real estate scams. They also became skilled at using intimidation not just on the streets but also in boardrooms and club offices. If someone refused a business deal, Ronnie might pay them a late-night visit. If someone owed money, Reggie's men made sure the payment arrived. Within just a few years, the firm was no longer a ragtag group of gangsters. It was one of the most feared and organized criminal syndicates in London. Their reputation for loyalty within their circle and brutality toward outsiders made them nearly untouchable. And unlike other criminal groups that operated quietly, the Krays didn't hide in the shadows. They moved confidently, almost daring authorities to challenge their growing empire. As the Kray twins' criminal empire grew stronger, they began to carefully craft a public image unlike any other gangsters of their time. Most criminals operated in the shadows, avoiding media attention and high society. But Ronnie and Reggie Kray embraced the spotlight. They wanted to be seen, admired, and feared, not just by their enemies but by the entire city of London. During the late 1950s and early 1960s, London's West End nightlife was booming. Jazz clubs, private members' lounges, and glamorous night spots attracted actors, singers, socialites, and wealthy businessmen. The Krays strategically bought and took control of some of the most popular clubs, such as Esmeralda's Barn in Knightsbridge, and turned them into stylish hubs where the criminal underworld and celebrity elite mingled under one roof. Inside these nightclubs, it wasn't unusual to see Reggie Kray shaking hands with famous entertainers or Ronnie sitting quietly in a corner, observing the crowd like a king surveying his court. They hosted celebrities like Judy Garland, rubbed shoulders with Frank Sinatra, and mingled with actors, politicians, and even members of the aristocracy. To the public eye, they were sharp-dressed gentlemen, always in tailored suits, driving luxury cars, and surrounded by beautiful women and influential people. They weren't just gangsters anymore, they had become public figures. The British press also played a major role in building their celebrity status. Tabloids frequently featured their photographs, showing them smiling at high-end events or posing with stars. Newspapers referred to them as the Dapper Twins, or the East End Princes, creating a strange dual image, notorious criminals on one hand, glamorous celebrities on the other. Many ordinary Londoners, especially in the East End, admired them. They saw the twins as local boys who had made it big, standing up to authority and living lives of power and luxury. This carefully maintained blend of fame and fear became one of their most powerful weapons. Their public celebrity image distracted many from the brutality happening behind the scenes. Police officers, politicians, and even journalists were hesitant to challenge them too openly, partly because of their social reach and partly out of fear. Their nightclubs were not just places of entertainment, they were strategic headquarters, allowing the twins to observe, manipulate, and control both criminal and legitimate worlds. Ronnie, despite his increasingly unstable mental health, enjoyed the notoriety and attention. He was blunt, openly gay at a time when homosexuality was criminalized, and often unpredictable in social settings, which only added to his mystique. Reggie, in contrast, was charismatic, charming, and often acted as the public face of their operations. Together, they created a dangerous and fascinating image, gangsters who didn't hide, but walked among the rich and famous as if they belonged there. Their celebrity status wasn't just for vanity, it was a calculated shield. By being in the public eye, they made it harder for law enforcement to move against them without causing a stir. At the same time, their growing fame attracted more powerful allies, giving them access to people in business, media, and politics who could offer protection or favors when needed. Beneath the polished suits, celebrity friends, and glamorous nightclubs, the real power of the Kray twins came from one thing: fear. They ruled their empire through calculated acts of violence, intimidation, and psychological control. In the underworld of 1960s London, reputation meant everything, and the Krays made sure their reputation was terrifying. Ronnie Kray was the face of pure menace. Volatile, unpredictable, and dangerously fearless, he had no hesitation in using extreme violence to settle disputes or send a warning. Reggie, while more composed and strategic, could be equally ruthless when necessary. Together, they mastered the art of making examples out of people. If anyone crossed them, whether a rival gangster, a disloyal associate, or a reluctant businessman, the punishment was swift, public, and brutal. One of the most chilling examples of their violent rule was the murder of George Cornell in 1966. Cornell was a member of the rival Richardson gang, based in South London. One evening, while sitting casually at the Blind Beggar pub in Whitechapel, Ronnie Kray walked in, approached him in front of dozens of witnesses, and shot him point blank in the head. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He simply walked out. This act wasn't just a killing, it was a message to the entire criminal underworld. The Krays were untouchable, and anyone who challenged them would pay the ultimate price. They also used torture and beatings to instill obedience within their organization. Ronnie was known for his vicious temper. He would attack people with his bare hands, bottles, knives, or anything within reach. Reggie, though calmer, had his own infamous moment when he stabbed Jack, the Hat McVitie, to death during a party in 1967, a murder that would later become a turning point in their downfall. Their violence wasn't random. It was often public or semi-public, designed so that stories would spread through London streets like wildfire. The Krays understood that fear was more effective than endless fighting. They didn't have to constantly prove their power through open warfare. Instead, they used targeted brutality to create an environment where people wouldn't dare to defy them. Rival gangs stayed out of their way, businessmen paid protection money without question, and potential witnesses kept silent, terrified of what might happen if they spoke. Even the police struggled to build cases because nobody would testify against them. Witnesses were too scared. Informants vanished. Their nightclubs became fortresses where violence could occur behind closed doors, with no one willing to talk afterward. Their reputation became so terrifying that in many cases, the mere threat of a visit from the Krays was enough to get people to comply. Their violent methods were theatrical as well as practical. Ronnie, in particular, seemed to enjoy the psychological dominance, making people squirm, threatening them in quiet whispers, or lashing out without warning to remind everyone who was in charge. Reggie balanced this with a colder, businesslike brutality that ensured their empire functioned smoothly. Together, they maintained a reign of terror over London's East End, blending fear and control so effectively that even powerful rivals and hardened criminals preferred to stay out of their way. For years, one of the most puzzling questions surrounding the Kray twins wasn't just how they rose so fast, but why no one seemed able to stop them. Despite murders committed in broad daylight, protection rackets spread across London, and countless people living in fear, the Krays operated almost openly and without serious consequences for a long time. The answer lies in the web of influence, corruption, and fear that they carefully built within London's political, social, and police circles, a network that made them appear almost untouchable. As their wealth and fame grew through their nightclubs and criminal operations, Ronnie and Reggie began moving in elite circles. Their West End clubs weren't just entertainment venues, they were strategic meeting places where criminals, celebrities, businessmen, politicians, and even corrupt officials rubbed shoulders. It wasn't uncommon for influential figures from the British establishment to be seen at Kray-owned venues, enjoying the luxury, networking in private rooms, and pretending not to notice who their hosts truly were. The twins were masters of charm when it suited them. Reggie, with his polished manner and smooth talking, made powerful people feel comfortable around him. Ronnie, unpredictable as he was, still commanded a strange fascination. They understood that power wasn't just on the streets, it was in offices, newspapers, and government halls, and if they could influence those spheres, their criminal activities would face fewer obstacles. Rumors and whispers spread through London that the Krays had friends in high places. People who owed them favors were blackmailed, or simply preferred to keep things quiet to protect their own reputations. There were stories of politicians attending their clubs, of the Krays holding compromising information on certain public figures, and of businessmen who benefited financially from their partnerships. Whether every story was true or not didn't even matter. The perception that they had these connections made the police and the public more hesitant to confront them. Within the Metropolitan Police, the situation was equally complicated. Some officers were corrupt, accepting bribes to look the other way, pass on information, or even tip the Krays off about ongoing investigations. Others weren't corrupt but were simply too frightened to act. Building a case against the Krays required witnesses, and witnesses were either silenced by fear or disappeared altogether. Court cases often collapsed because no one dared to testify. Judges, journalists, and detectives understood the danger of going against the twins. The Krays cleverly cultivated a dual image, publicly glamorous and charming, privately brutal and ruthless. This combination created a dangerous fog where law enforcement and politicians were unsure how far they could go without personal risk or scandal. Even when Scotland Yard began paying closer attention, their early attempts to investigate the twins were often thwarted by lack of evidence, unwilling witnesses, and suspected leaks from within. This illusion of invincibility became one of their greatest weapons. People genuinely believed that the Krays couldn't be touched, not by rival gangs, not by journalists, and certainly not by the police. It wasn't just their violence that protected them, it was their ability to entangle themselves with powerful figures, blending criminal might with social influence. They created a system where fear, loyalty, corruption, and prestige all worked together to keep them on top. By the mid to late 1960s, the Kray twins had become household names, a strange mix of celebrity charm and underworld terror. But behind the scenes, their empire was beginning to crack. Their growing arrogance, public violence, and increased attention from both media and authorities made it impossible for their activities to stay hidden forever. For years, they had operated with near impunity, but that changed when Scotland Yard decided to strike back with unprecedented determination. At the center of this operation was Detective Superintendent Leonard "Nipper" Reed, a man who had studied the Krays for years. Unlike others in law enforcement who were intimidated or compromised, Nipper Reed refused to be swayed. He understood that the only way to bring the Krays down was through a systematic, well-planned, and evidence-heavy investigation that couldn't be destroyed by fear or corruption. Reed began quietly assembling a special task force, separate from potentially corrupted local units. This team gathered intelligence, tracked associates, monitored nightclubs, and slowly mapped out the Krays' entire network. Instead of rushing in, they spent years building a watertight case, collecting statements from anyone brave enough to talk, often in secret locations to protect witnesses from retaliation. It was a slow and dangerous process because the Krays ruled through fear, and convincing anyone to speak against them was like asking people to sign their own death warrants. The turning point came when internal cracks appeared within the firm itself. Some members grew resentful, others became scared of Ronnie's increasingly unstable behavior, and a few realized that the Krays' days of invincibility were numbered. Quietly, key informants began cooperating, feeding Scotland Yard the evidence they desperately needed. Every small testimony and piece of intelligence helped build a larger picture of murder, extortion, and organized crime. 2 murders in particular gave investigators the leverage they needed. George Cornell's murder at the Blind Beggar Pub, a brazen public killing by Ronnie Kray in 1966. Jack, the Hat McVitie's murder in 1967, personally carried out by Reggie Kray in a violent stabbing at a party. These were not whispered crimes in alleyways, they were bold, shocking acts that proved the twins believed themselves above the law. Scotland Yard seized on these cases as anchors for prosecution, knowing that if they could prove these murders, the rest of the empire would unravel. On May 8, 1968, after months of secret preparations, police launched a massive series of coordinated raids across London. Dozens of officers simultaneously hit multiple Kray-associated properties, arresting Ronnie, Reggie, and key members of the firm in one sweeping operation. The image of the all-powerful twins began to shatter as they were handcuffed and taken away in front of flashing cameras. The public, who had once seen them as untouchable figures, watched the spectacle unfold like the fall of dark royalty. But the real battle wasn't just the arrest, it was the courtroom. Prosecutors worked carefully to protect witnesses, some of whom had to be hidden and relocated for safety. The Krays, who had once relied on intimidation to keep people silent, now faced witnesses willing to testify under protection. Nipper Reed's patience and strategic approach paid off. The case was airtight, built on years of evidence rather than rushed accusations. Their arrest sent shockwaves through London's underworld. For the first time, the Kray twins' empire, built on fear, influence, and violence, was on the defensive, facing the full force of the law in a way they had never experienced before. When the Kray twins were finally brought to trial in 1969, it marked the end of an era. The once untouchable kings of London's East End now sat in the dock as the world watched. After one of the most high-profile trials in British criminal history, both Ronnie and Reggie Kray were sentenced to life imprisonment for the murders of George Cornell and Jack, the Hat McVitie, with a recommendation that they serve at least 30 years. Their older brother Charlie received a 10-year sentence for his role in their criminal activities. The iron grip they once held over London had finally been broken. But in many ways their legend was just beginning. Even behind bars, the Kray twins maintained a powerful presence in British culture. Newspapers continued to write about them. People sent letters to them in prison. Books, interviews, and sensational stories kept their names alive. They became a dark fascination, representing both the glamour and the brutality of organized crime in the 1960s. For some in the East End, especially older generations, the Krays were remembered as local boys who never forgot their roots. Stories circulated of how they helped struggling families, donated money to neighbors, or protected locals from rival gangs. This image of the Krays as Robin Hood-like figures persisted in certain communities, painting them as men who enforced their own kind of order in a rough, post-war London. Whether these stories were exaggerated or not, they contributed to their mythical status. On the other hand, many remembered them for what they truly were: violent, manipulative, and ruthless gangsters who ruled through fear. The murders, torture, and psychological terror they inflicted on countless individuals left deep scars that outlived their empire. Those who had suffered under their rule spoke of them not as folk heroes, but as dangerous men who thrived on intimidation and control. Over time, their story became woven into British pop culture. Films, documentaries, and biographies explored their rise and fall, often highlighting their duality: charming and stylish on the surface, but cold-blooded underneath. The 1990 film The Krays and the 2015 film Legend, starring Tom Hardy as both twins, brought their story to new generations, further cementing their place in criminal folklore. Ronnie died in Broadmoor Hospital in 1995 after years of declining mental health. Reggie was released from prison on compassionate grounds in 2000 due to cancer and died just months later. Even in death, their funerals attracted massive crowds, filled with onlookers, admirers, and the curious. Decades after their reign ended, their names still carried a mixture of fear, respect, and fascination. The legacy of the Kray twins is a complex one, part myth, part history. They were not just gangsters. They were cultural symbols of a unique time in London's history. They embodied the blurred line between glamour and violence, between public admiration and private terror. To this day, their story raises uncomfortable questions about power, loyalty, and the way criminals can become legends. The story of Ronnie and Reggie Kray is more than just a tale of crime. It's a reflection of a London caught between post-war struggle, glamour, and brutality. They rose from humble streets to become feared kings, blending celebrity charm with cold-blooded violence in a way the city had never seen before. Their empire was built on loyalty, intimidation, and a reputation that stretched far beyond the East End. But like all empires built on fear, it eventually crumbled, taken down not by rivals, but by the law and their own arrogance. Even decades later, the Kray twins remain a chilling symbol of power, myth, and moral ambiguity. Some see them as icons, others as monsters. But one thing is certain: their story left a mark on London that time has not erased. Ladies and gentlemen, this was the rise and fall of the Kray twins, the feared underworld kings of 1960s London.